Marriage. When we think of marriage, it's easy to think of hearts and cupids and Valentine's Day and big white dresses and expensive, expensive church services and parties and all sorts of other ceremonies and celebrations that mark romance. It's easy to think of our parents or our grandparents, something that we maybe hope to become, or maybe relationships that we hope not to emulate in our own marriages. Marriage is something that is almost expected of us, in Christian circles especially, but even in society more broadly. Marriage is a mark of maturity, of real adulthood, of some sort of stability in society. Marriage, though, in a lot of places is a lot more complicated than that. As we've seen in different stories from other places, sometimes marriages are arranged, sometimes love is something you grow into, sometimes marriage is something that limits and binds us in really problematic and horrible ways. Sometimes marriages don't work out and they lead to separation and divorce. Sometimes marriages are really, really toxic and are the sorts of situations that no one should ever stay in. But in literature, marriage also works on a symbolic level that isn't exactly all of the romance and fancy dresses and cupids and hearts, but at the same time isn't this idea of destruction and sorrow and a misery that one needs to escape. In literature, marriage frequently functions as a symbol of reconciliation. Marriage is a way of imagining what redemption might look like, of imagining how things that are very different might come together and form a new sort of unity that is generative and that gives life. Now, for women in literature, marriage has long functioned as a sign of integration into society, a way that they secure their place. And this is why in women's stories so often, especially in the Western tradition, women's stories are about finding a proper marriage partner. And then you find that marriage partner and you get married and it is happily ever after, because that is the story, right? You've got your reconciliation, your redemption, you are in society, you are now stable, the book closes, you're done. The problem is, of course, that image of marriage, especially for women, it's a form of narrative death, right? The story's over, you're done. And that's really quite an issue when we think about what it means to imagine marriage. Because if marriage ends a character's story, then marriage isn't about redemption and reconciliation in life. Marriage, in terms of narrative structure, is actually a marker of death. So how can marriage be a marker or a symbol of redemption and reconciliation while being a marker of narrative death for female characters? Well, partly this has to do with the ways in which marriage was imagined in the 19th century, in the novel in particular. So people like Sir Walter Scott would use the marriage of a Scottish lady to an English fighter, knight, lord sort of person to imagine the unity of England and Scotland and how we can form a country like Great Britain. Benjamin Disraeli used it to imagine how you might marry the rich and the poor in a society. How do we join the rich and the poor? We join them in marriage. And so in his novel Sybil, you have a poor woman and a rich man, and somehow they fall in love and they make a new way, and that brings us to unity. Potok does the same sort of thing in his novel The Promise when he marries Danny, a man who grew up in the Hasidic community and is really representative of modern Orthodoxy, and Rachel, who is from a very secular Jewish family, and they marry. It's a way of imagining a sort of new direction for Judaism that would be not quite Hasidic, but certainly not Rachel's secular world. And in all of these, really, it's not about the woman's character or about her death or about the end of her story, although that is what happens. And the problem with all of these, even though they're a way of celebrating integration and reconciliation and redemption, we don't actually see that work out, right? We don't get to see Rachel and Danny and how they actually form their household. We don't really see England and Scotland living together in this wonderful new union in Walter Scott's novels. Same thing with Benjamin Disraeli's novels. We don't see the rich and poor living and forming an actual society afterwards. It's kind of like, and it was good and we'll just leave it at that. And that does cause problems, because then how do we actually imagine this new world, this reconciled situation, if we don't tell the stories of marriage? In the Bible, marriage also functions as a symbol of reconciliation and redemption. But what's interesting is that the Bible actually gives us some insights into what that might look like. Because, of course, the marriage ceremony happens really, really early in the Bible. The marriage ceremony between God and Israel happens at Sinai. And they're joined, and then we get to see that relationship play out. So it's not narrative death, it's the beginning of the story. We see something really similar in Marilynne Robinson's Lila. And that's the novel that we're going to be focusing on in this unit. Lila is set vaguely in the 1940s, although exact dates are never really given and it doesn't really seem to matter. Unlike The Handmaid's Tale, this is in third-person narration, but it's grounded in Lila's memory, just like The Handmaid's Tale was. So you get a sense of stream of consciousness, of jumping between the past and the present as Lila tells her story. And part of why that's important is because we know Lila is already married in this book. In fact, this is the third novel in a trilogy. The first is quite famous. It's called Gilead. And it's from the perspective of the Reverend as he writes a letter to his son. So there's no surprise in Lila that she marries the Reverend. There's no surprise that they have a child. Readers already know that this is going to be the case. And so it's important that we're wrestling with memory and how we remember, because it's helping us to imagine what marriage actually looks like, what real reconciliation, what real redemption look like once we know they're actually going to happen. As opposed to other marriage plots where you're like, is it going to happen? Are they going to get together? Will we be able to bring rich and poor together? Will we be able to bring the homeless woman who used to work in a whorehouse together with the small town Midwestern preacher? Will they be able to find a way? Well, that's a settled question. Yes. Okay, well then what does it look like once they do? And this gives us the opportunity then to really think about how abuse, how neglect, how a lot of deep, deep psychological trauma might shape redemption, how Lila's childhood as a homeless worker might shape the ways in which she's able to love and be loved. It gives us the opportunity to think about how grief and death might shape the ways that the Reverend is able to love and be loved. And I'm not going to lie, this is a very dark book. It is a beautiful, beautiful book. But for all of the beauty, there is a lot of darkness. It begins with a child who's, again, not given a specific age, but Lila, when she's 2 or 3, she is abused, she is neglected, and then she's kidnapped. And then she begins her life on the run with her kidnapper, except her kidnapper doll really in some ways is a sort of guardian angel, because there's little doubt that Lila probably would have died from neglect had she been left at home. But on the road, as they move from farm to farm and work and try to make a living, things are not easy. There's always fear, there's always suspicion, no one can be trusted. How does someone who is abandoned, abused, neglected, kidnapped, who's always on the run, who is taught by every circumstance in their life not to trust anyone, what does it look like when a person like that comes into love? That's one of the questions that Lila really wrestles with. And in doing so, it helps us to understand better, I think, what it means for all of us to come into God's love. And so as you're reading Lila, one of the things I'd like you to consider is this. What does redemption really look like?